Hello, Ted Morrissey here, making a video mainly for my MFA students who are in the throes of completing their thesis and are about to leave the nest. And so I've been trying to give them some thoughts, some things to consider as they sort of transition into being a writer at large and not part of a writing program. And the topic I want to talk about today may seem a little depressing, but yet I think it's possible to find some glimmer of hope in it as well. And what I want to talk about is the fact that uh, most of us, especially when we're younger writers, we imagine a particular career path. We imagine finishing our degree. We imagine finding an agent, perhaps, after we've written our novel or whatever collection of something. And then getting a publisher and then readers and all that sort of thing. And it's possible, but I think as time goes on, it gets increasingly difficult to achieve that in exactly that way. First of all, that isn't necessarily a path to happiness. Um, there are writers who manage to make that happen, who manage to get a legit agent and get a contract with one of the handful of commercial publishers left in the US, and they get their book out there and all that kind of thing. But again, it doesn't necessarily turn into a sort of Cinderella story. A lot of things can kind of go haywire along the way, and just the overall experience isn't particularly satisfying. As a small press publisher, I am regularly contacted, I know once or twice a year maybe, by an author who had it all, had an agent, had a contract with Penguin or Random House or whoever it might be, published a book, and now they're like, never again. I just want to find a small publisher, just want to focus on the work, get a book out there, let a few people read it, hopefully, and that'll be that, right? They don't want to jump through all the hoops, take all of the time that it's required, wait all of the waiting periods they have to wait. And then the other thing, too, is I'm contacted by authors who have found a publisher, sometimes another small press, larger than mine, but that would be almost any of them. And their book has come out and then immediately went out of print. Had an initial press run of whatever, a few hundred, maybe, a few hundred copies, a couple thousand, maybe, who knows. But it's no more. It didn't sell. It was, lost money, whatever, which is pretty much inevitable. And so they've come to me with, gosh, I've got this book, and I really would like to see it in print again, or still, would you be interested in publishing my book, and so on. And to date, I've always said no. I don't need to lose money on the same book that someone else lost money on. I have plenty of my own books to lose money on, etc. So the point here is that what we imagine to be a path to publishing happiness does maybe lead to that for some people. Now, one of the few writers I know personally who set their sights on that path, and it's happening. They got the big time agent. They got the big time contract. There are movie deals in the works. They are quite depressed and anxious and unhappy because now they feel all this weight on them to keep producing books that actually make money. They have all these other ideas for books they'd like to pursue. They love to write, but in this particular genre, with this particular series that they've established, they feel they have to keep writing and producing for their agent, for their publisher, for their spouse, who is now somewhat dependent on their income. And it's taken all the fun, all the joy out of writing, right? So the grass is always greener, pretty much, right? So I want to talk about, well, what what do we do then? If the publishing dream is A, almost impossible to achieve, and B, oftentimes is more of a nightmare than a dream if we do achieve it, what are we doing this for? Well, I want to submit that we want to go back to basics, and what we need to be doing it for is the pure joy of it. And I've said, in other videos and other contexts, that over the decades, I've changed my definition of what it means to be a successful writer. If you'd asked me 20 years ago, I would have said just all that. You get an agent, you get a book deal, maybe a movie deal. You're sitting on the couch next to Oprah, talking, about your book and so forth, so on. That isn't how I define a successful writer any longer. A successful writer is a writer who keeps writing, whatever it is: novels, stories, poetry, essays, scripts, whatever. They keep writing. They find a way to get their writing out into the world somehow or another, through small press publishing, through self-publishing, graffiti on the sides of buildings, whatever it might be, right? And actually, I'm serious about that last one. One of my favorite writers, that's one of the ways she gets her work out into the world, is through graffiti and public posters on the sides of buses and so forth. And they contribute to the writing community somehow or another. And that can mean a lot of things. It could be being an editor of a journal. It could be publishing your own little journal. It could be just going to events by other writers and supporting them. It could be financially supporting a group. There's a little online journal that I found a few years ago that I really, really dig what they're doing. And so I pay for their website every year. It's not a whole lot of money, and I can afford that little bit. So I take that off their plate. They don't have to worry about it. I pay for their website, every year. It's $120 or something. I forget what it is. So there's that, right? And obviously, I publish other people's work. I have an online journal that I publish, new work. In the podcast, we feature new writers. Usually, this next podcast, we're going to go back a bit in time, but usually it's brand new fiction by living authors and so forth. So there's lots of things you can do to be supportive of the writing community, and so I think that's important. I want to give some context here, and I want to do that by going to this little baby. This is New American Review, and specifically New American Review number 10. New American Review was a really interesting project, a literary magazine that was started in the late 60s, and they had a little bit different idea. As you can see, they published this kind of pulp version, very inexpensive version. Usually literary magazines tend to be more on the kind of artsy side, and oftentimes have very expensive designs with nice paper and color, artwork, reproduction, and all kinds of stuff. And that's great. But they went a different route. They wanted to try to get great writing by great authors into the hands of as many people as possible, and hopefully people who maybe didn't normally read that kind of writing. So they went this route, and they developed this very inexpensive paperback edition approach. And in the late 60s and early 70s, you could find this in bookstores, but also airport gift shops, drugstores, grocery stores, all the kinds of places you normally didn't run into really good writing. Right? New American Review. And the reason I kind of stumbled onto them, they stopped publishing in the late 70s. They only managed to publish about 10 years. I think originally they published 3 editions a year, about 100,000, I think so, in the hundreds of thousands of copies per issue. Again, mass distributed across the country. They eventually had to pare down to 2 issues a year, up the price a little bit. Eventually, they had to, stop publishing after about a decade. But for a while, they were getting really good writing into the hands of readers who maybe normally wouldn't even have exposure to that. Again, I discovered them because my idol, William Gass, his story In the Heart of the Country, which was the first story of Gass's that I read when I discovered him myself. And it was published in issue number 1 of New American Review. So I got hold of that, and that kind of led me to looking at other issues. He eventually appeared in 4 issues of New American Review, and then they were an offshoot of New American Library, which published Gass's first book. That's a whole other story, right? You can find videos about that too, by the way. But anyway, I started looking at New American Review, and in issue number 9, I think it was, they started doing this online symposium. And one second. Okay, so they started doing this online symposium, and basically they emailed this standard questionnaire, not email, just way before email, they mailed the standard questionnaire, or maybe handed to someone at a bar, a writer, a poet at a bar, this standard questionnaire, and just let them kind of respond to it however they would. They could answer all the questions, some of the questions, they could answer at length, they can answer briefly, whatever. And then they published those writers and poets and essayists' responses to this kind of standard questionnaire. And they did it over the course of 3 issues. Really, really interesting. But they started it in like 1969, I believe. And then it kind of spilled over into the 1970 issues. And it was in recognition of the fact that most writers felt by the late 60s the book was a dying form, the novel, the fiction, the etc. Poetry too was a dying form, that it had its heyday, going back maybe to the 18th century with Fielding and so forth, and certainly into the 19th century with Dickens and Trollope and Thackeray and the Brontes and on and on. Eventually Henry James, and then bridge over into the 20th century, Joseph Conrad, and you got Joyce and Woolf and Hemingway and up through Vonnegut, etc. But at that point, by the end of the 1950s, the heyday of the book was declined. There'd been a fatal shot, and hadn't died yet, but was definitely, dying on the table. And that's because of television. That with the widespread, popularity of television, especially in the 1950s, that people stopped reading as a major pastime. And so by the early 60s, writers were already feeling that. They were already being affected by, just almost as if it had fallen off a cliff in terms of the interest in writing, especially really good writing and so forth. Again, we're talking early 60s. So the editors of New American Review, they again surveyed a bunch of writers and asked them a bunch of questions, kind of all related to that, one way or another, and then got their responses. I found this really fascinating because, 50, 60 years later, that slow death of the book is still in progress, and maybe the final breaths are being wheezed right now. But I think it's interesting to kind of look back, because a lot of their concerns were the concerns that we face. And so I want to share a little bit of that with you. And then this is very much concurrent with what's going on with this guy, my idol, William Gass, who famously, at least famously in certain circles, said in 1971, he was working on his novel, The Tunnel. He'd been at it for about 5 years. It would take him another 20 to finish. He didn't know that at the time. But the interviewer asked him, interviewer named McCulley, can you estimate when your book, The Tunnel, will be finished or published? Again, it started appearing in 1969, I think. Gass says, I began The Tunnel in 1966. I imagine it is several years away yet. Boy, was that right. It came out in 1995. He finished it in 1992. Who knows, he says. Perhaps it will be such a good book, no one will want to publish it. I live on that hope. He was sort of being flippant, sort of being funny, but he was also serious. That already in 1971, he and others could see that there was this inverse correlation between the quality of a book, the quality of the writing, and the likelihood of its being published, in light of the fact that there were fewer and fewer and fewer readers who really wanted well-written, provocative books, right? And this is concurrent with what's going on with New American View and their symposium, their survey that they're sending out, because they too are responding to this drop off in interest of the book. And let me just share a couple of the questions that they sent out. Again, can you see? Well, see, it was just these. This was installment 2. There were 3 installments. First one in the previous issue, and then this one, and then obviously a third. And again, just a series of questions. And again, writers could, obviously they could choose not to respond to them, but they could do it however they want. They could pick and choose some questions, not other questions. Some writers responded with kind of just a long essay that sort of spoke to either directly or indirectly a lot of these issues. Some writers just kind of clicked them off as if it were like a standard test or exam or something, and they number 1, and they wrote their response number 1, number 2, wrote their response number 2, etc. But here's the kind of lead in. The following responses continue the symposium that began in NAR number 9. Its purpose is to inquire into the changes that have occurred in writing during the past decade. So basically the decade of the 60s, as writers themselves have experienced them. In order to focus the discussion, we asked contributors these 6 questions, which they were free to answer as they chose. And I'm not going to read all 6 questions because they're all like multi-part questions, so it's actually more like 20 questions. But I'll read just a few particularly relevant ones to what I'm talking about today. And the first one is, why do you continue to write? What purpose does your work serve? Do you feel yourself part of a rear guard action in the service of a declining tradition? Has your sense of vocation altered significantly in recent years? I would, to some of those questions, the yes or no questions, I would say, as far as I'm concerned, yes, I definitely feel part of a rear guard action in the service of a declining tradition. That's for show. A little bit later, sorry, I want to make sure I'm focusing on the right thing here. I'll read this one. This is number 4, has writing entered a postmodern era in which the relevance of the great modern writers like Joyce, Eliot, Mann, Faulkner, etc., has declined? If so, what seem to be the literary principles of the postmodern age? If not, what principles of modernism are still dominant and valuable? Obviously, there was this age that became known as literary postmodernism. Never, complete agreement on what that meant, even when it started and if it ended, when it ended. Are we still postmodern? Are we postmodern? I like to think of myself as neo-postmodern, but that's a whole nother thing, right? But clearly, this sense that there's been this sea change, and we're no longer, up there with Joyce and Eliot and Woolf and Pound and those characters. We're in this different era. And then this is interesting. Number 5, has there been a general collapse of literary standards in recent years? Are you conscious of a conflict between your past standards and your present ones? In other words, if you were aiming for a particular quality of work before, have you kind of lowered your standards to try to match market demands, right? Because that's where, again, today we tend to find ourselves. That friend of mine I was talking about, who, when I first met this person, they were a dyed-in-the-wool literary experimental writer. Then they decided to, kind of quite honestly dumb down their work to be appealing to a more mass audience. And it's worked, but it seems to have sort of let the air out of the balloon in terms of the joy of writing, the joy of creating, right? And then the last one, has literary criticism and journalism kept pace with and faith with the best fiction, poetry, and drama produced in the 60s? Now, I think at the time it was keeping pace. Those writers I mentioned who were, kind of the high priests and priestesses, although mainly priests of that, which is a whole nother, why was postmodernism so sexist? That's another thing, right? Another topic. But, the Pynchon and Barth and, Vonnegut and Gass, he was usually grouped in with postmodernists. In fact, I discovered him in an anthology of postmodern fiction. the Norton Anthology of Postmodern American Fiction. But he himself didn't like that label for himself, and he liked to think of himself as a very late modernist. Labels are weird, but anywho, he was generally grouped with that group, and certainly they were being read, they were being reviewed in major outlets, they were having critical books written about their work, people were giving conference presentations about them, and so forth. Nowadays, I don't know that there's any serious writers whose work is being looked at by scholars. As a lot of my students know, I just have returned from the American Literature Association conference in Chicago, and I made the observation in another video that I made at the end of that conference that looking at the program, this was the 35th annual program, the presentations the authors covered were probably almost identical, maybe 85-90%, from the first conference, 35 years ago. Poe, Hawthorne, Dickinson, Wallace, Wallace Stevens rather, William Carlos Williams, on and on and on. Very, very little at the conference in terms of presentations about new authors. And I was part of a Gass panel that I organized, and Gass was still alive and publishing when I started my scholarly interest in him, but now he's part of the dearly departed, right? I just don't see it. I don't know who, like, academically is studying contemporary writers. I don't know what writers they would be if they were being studied. There's just been such a dearth of interest in serious writing that no one seems to be studying it. No one seems to be writing about it on a regular basis or at all, that as I can find it. But anyway, so those were the questions. 1969 is when this particular group of authors was. Like Allen Ginsberg, he just literally took the thing, scribbled in some responses, and sent it back to them, and they just published it as is. Most writers actually wrote responses. But I weirdly take solace in this. It could be depressing to think that 50 years ago, 70 years ago, whatever it would be, they were not 70, more like 50. They were sensing the decline of the book, and it really hasn't rebounded since, at least the serious book, whatever that means, right? And so that could be pretty darn depressing. And I do get discouraged at times when, I publish a book and it gets really good reviews and no one reads it anyway. But a lot of us are experiencing that. About all of us are experiencing that, right? But I found that this writer's response, Wilfred Sheed, to be particularly, again, comforting, to know that I haven't been alone. I'm not alone in trying to write, meaningful books that are largely being ignored. And I'm just going to read you a few little things of what Wilfred Sheed said in 1970. And he was a novelist, short story writer, obviously well respected in his day. His name has kind of fallen off the historical radar. But Sheed writes, "To begin at the beginning, there is no writing for glory anymore, not great big glory anyway. Outside of English departments and the publishing warrants, only about 3 American writers are widely known by name. And of these, at least 2 are famous for non-literary reasons." And I think he's referring to writers like Hemingway, who had a really good reputation as a writer, but really most of the public attention was on Hemingway's exploits, his big game fishing, his safaris, his extramarital affairs, his serial divorcing of one wife to marry a younger version and then divorcing her, and and all of that, right? So I think Hemingway is probably one of the writers. I have ideas about maybe some of the others, but Hemingway is probably one you would be familiar with, right? He goes on, "There is enough doubt about the future of print and of a recognizable human race to make such speculation pointless. One still indulges it occasionally, but weakly, weakly, W-E-A-K-L-Y, and foolishly out of professional habit. And so, again, about the future of print. Now, again, this is 1970. This is really before the computer. I mean, computers had been kind of invented as we think of them in the 60s, but they certainly were not ubiquitous, in 1970. I was in high school in the late 70s, and I worked for a newspaper, and they had what we called VDTs, video display terminals, and they were basically big word processors. I mean big. And that was like cutting edge. I mean, because it was a professional newspaper, they had gotten these cutting edge devices. So I was word processing, and so forth, which basically only meant you could copy and paste and move stuff around. That was about all it did. Before the average bear was in the late 70s. And so in 1970, computers had not really become ubiquitous, which means computer games had not become ubiquitous, which means that the internet had not become, a thing. And it means that obviously things like streaming services via your television was way in the future. But all of those things continued the decline that books and authors of books were experiencing in the late 60s thanks to television, which again had replaced reading as the number one national pastime. And so as these other entertainment things kept coming along, one after another, the reading kept slipping. And, commercial publishers are called commercial publishers because the idea is that they're going to make money. And so if you don't have people reading these books, then there's no point in producing them because they're just going to lose money. I mentioned at the beginning of this video, there's only about 5 commercial publishers left in the US. It seems like there's more because if you go to a Barnes & Noble, by the way, there's only like one national bookstore left, right? And they mainly are selling stationery and coffee mugs. You look at the spines of books or on the title page, and it looks like, oh my gosh, there's all these publishers. But what happened over the course of about 20 to 30 years is they kept being subsumed into these corporate entities. So there's only about a handful of sort of parent companies, and then they have all these different imprints, right? They publish different kinds of books, but they all kind of feed the beast of whatever the parent company is, and they want them to make money. They have to make money, otherwise, editors are going to be fired, marketing people are going to be replaced, et cetera, et cetera. I've mentioned elsewhere that the only publisher who is sort of deliberately publishing books that are more artsy or more serious is Knopf, which is now an arm of Random House. It is their loss leader. They basically expect that the books published through Knopf will lose money, but hopefully they will win some nice prizes, bring some prestige to the house, and maybe if they're lucky, after they win a National Book Award or whatever it might be, maybe they'll break even. So that'd be good. Gas was published primarily by Knopf, especially towards the end of his writing life, right? Otherwise, authors and books are expected to make money, and if they don't, you're done, right? So when you're contacting agents, which are not a charity business, right, they're looking at the marketability of the manuscript, but also the author. And can they convince a publisher to take a chance on that book and that author to make money? And then therefore the agent, can make a percentage of that. And if they look at a manuscript and it's too out there, too experimental, too whatever, and if the author is unknown and of a demographic that isn't going to be particularly attractive to a lot of publishers, they aren't going to bother. Not that the book is bad, not that the author is a bad person or a bad writer, but they're not going to be able to make money off of it. So what's the point? Again, there was a time when agents, would take an author under their wing and know that at first they're not going to have much of a readership and that they're going to nurture them and encourage them. And then by the same token, editors at publishing houses, when there were dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of publishing houses just in New York. They would take on an author that they really liked their voice, their style, knowing that initially, we're not going to make very much money or any money to speak of, and that was a thing. That's no longer a thing. Joyce Carol Oates talks about when her first publication was a short story collection, and her publisher took out a full-page ad in the New York Review of Books to advertise a short story collection, a first book by an unknown writer with kind of a strange name, Joyce Carol Oates, and put her on the map. And as she says now, that would never happen. You'd never have, first of all, a major publisher publishing a short story collection by an unknown writer. It's not going to happen. And if they did, they certainly are not going to invest in a full-page ad in the New York Review of Books or whatever it might be. It just would be a complete waste of money. So that doesn't happen anymore. All right. But she goes on. He says, on the other hand, now that you, novelists, are down in the company of the poets, you might as well write a masterpiece. You're only going to impress a few people, whatever you do, so you might as well impress the hell out of them, and please yourself too if you can. The consequence, as in poetry, is the limited masterpiece, the one that doesn't take too long or wear you out too much, right? He says a bit later, why do we do it? Ask a bathtub tenor why he sings. Once upon a time, we found that we could, right? And so I had embraced this philosophy long before I read Sheed's discussion of it, that the idea was to do your best writing and to take joy in that. And if it gets out there and people read it and respond to it, that's great. But the purpose is to write for the sake of the art, right? And Gass talked about the same thing, and I've quoted him in other videos and so forth, talking about that as well. The serious writing nowadays, he said, has to be done for the sake of the art. And so I take some comfort in that I'm not alone in wanting to do good work, wanting to challenge myself to keep doing different things and new things and change my style and try to get better. And that's enough. If other people read it and respond to it, that would be wonderful. But the writing itself has to sustain most of us. Again, sometimes people break through, sometimes because of like TikTok, you've got authors breaking through. But again, these are not authors who are writing really serious, experimental, thought-provoking books. These are faster reads, and that's fine. Good for them, right? If I could write that way, I would, but I can't seem to. So we have to take comfort in the fact that we are writing something that pleases us, that we're challenging ourselves, and that if we can find some way of getting out in the world, whether it's through literary journals, small presses, publishing it ourselves, that's what we do, right? And if it touches one or two or three or four or five readers, then that's a good day, right? That's a win. And if somehow it gets beyond that, well, that's just icing on the unicorn cake or something. It's a weird metaphor. So I also think of the cave painter, right? I think of this metaphor too sometimes. You've got this prehistoric artist maybe going to the farthest, darkest corner of the cave where hardly anyone goes, or maybe no one goes, and with their torch and their pigments that they've gotten from nature or whatever, they create this incredible artwork. A lot of those kind of cave paintings, we obviously don't know who painted them. We have no idea, and it's just pure speculation why they may have been painted. Maybe they served some utilitarian purpose. Maybe it was just purely aesthetic, just for the joy of painting. But they painted this stuff in the farthest, darkest corners of the cave. probably understanding that next to no one in their lifetime, certainly their lifetime where they lived to be 30, that was old age then. Um, we're going to see it, but yet they did it for the joy of it. They did it the same reason bathtub tenors sing, and and lo and behold, millennia later, it's discovered and it's appreciated, and so maybe that will happen with some of our work as well. Maybe 5 readers in 2024, but maybe 5 million in 3024. Maybe, who knows? All right. So yeah, pursue what you want to pursue in terms of if you want to try to get the agent, if you want to try to get the big book deal, if you want to try to get your manuscript with a really well respected indie press. Absolutely, go for it. It's a waiting game, and a lot of time is going to pass as you wait for responses, and there's no guarantee that being taken on by an agent or getting a contract with a publisher is going to mean literary happiness. But if that's what you want to do, go for it. But the important thing is to keep writing, to keep enjoying the process, and to, again, try to be part of the solution in terms of supporting other writers, other presses, um, helping others get their work out there somehow or another. All right. I'm going to stop there, and yeah, keep on writing.